folk singers to go into the Washington Square Park on Sundays for 15 years, and one year they decided not to do it. They came up with reasons not to do it. So it wouldn't surprise me that people would just say, you know what, I'm feeling really repressed here. I'm going to go somewhere where there's more sun and I can feel less repressed. But I also do think that there was just a period in the early mid-60s where Los Angeles took over. The story of the Mamas and the Papas heading there, of Jim McGuinn later. Yeah. They were, and they moved out there, and there was a period where LA just took over, for sure.
Cass Elliot was a good friend of mine, and before Mamas and Papas, and she had come up from Baltimore to live here. But I would just want to, first of all, I would suggest you all read the chapters in Tony's book, because he really does document very well the tensions in the folk music world. And in the early 60s, there was no going to L.A. There was no going anywhere. Everyone was coming to New York because of Greenwich Village and what was happening here. And they all came from someplace else. It wasn't an indigenous sort of folk scene that happened. Some of it flowed through Boston, but it really was here. It was central, and that's where people had gotten signed to the labels that they got signed to. What happened with L.A. is that some of the record companies and the majors, which Tony doesn't go into too much, then started to pick up on the more commercial aspects of folk music, and they came out of the sort of L.A. section. But, Jolie, there's always this rivalry between L.A., we were first, we did it, and New York, no, we did it, we were first. The riots, and what happened, because I lived in L.A., I was an actor, and I lived in L.A. in the 60s 2 or 3 different times, and the scene there was very different from what you had in New York City, except they had one thing in common. They had a police department that didn't understand this new underground music on either coast.
That's very common.
Right, we have another question over here.
First, I want to say thank you very much for tonight. And listening to the discussion was a very intriguing kind of precursor into like going on a subway and just reading through it. But I wanted to ask you. You had mentioned how you felt like you were getting stuck in a certain period because there was so much going on, which led to just wondering how long did it take for you to kind of like assemble 50 years and try to like integrate it into like a streamline?
It's been at least a 5-year project. I think that I signed the deal for the book about 5 years ago, and there was probably at least a year before that, and maybe longer, of putting together a proposal. That I don't want to suggest that either I spent the last 5-6 years doing nothing but writing on the book, working on the book. This was a lot of work. It's not as thick a book as the one I wrote on Keith Moon, but because there's so much subject matter, there were times where it felt very, very overwhelming. And funny enough, that year 1965, which is a year I sort of felt like I knew in terms of its music, was the most overwhelming, because I think to have been sort of 18 then, it must have just been amazing. There's something new happening every week. But to really answer your question, it's kind of been a 5-year process, and obviously some of the information I knew, and there's a lot of hard work in the middle of it.
But you also had Joey D and the Starlighters. You had all this kind of music that was coming out of New York, and then the British hit, the Beatles and that onslaught of people after the Beatles, and that had a profound effect upon rock and roll in a sense in New York City. So the folk movement sort of took up the slack, because the folk movement held on to the turfing of the United States and of the United States against Britain, and so there are so many things you could talk about in this 10-year period that we haven't even mentioned. But the rivalry between L.A. and New York was nothing like what the Brits and the U.S. and what it did to U.S. musicians. We had the Beach Boys, we had the Young Rascals, we had a number of bands that sold records and were up there. But it seemed like everyone wanted to be in a British-sounding band, except for the Dylans, the Jonies, the Judys, etc.
Thank you. We have a question over here.
Since you're talking about rivalries between cities already, and you mentioned the New York punk scene, as far as I understand, there is a discussion going on where punk was invented in London or in New York, and I'd be interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. As a Brit, I spent most of my life believing that the British invented punk rock, and And I remember, but I have to say, we grow up in Britain with an amazing amount of anti-American prejudice. It's instilled. I think it's like injected into us when we're born. And I remember once watching this long American documentary, like an 8-part PBS series, and it was all focused on America. And I just thought that was kind of, xenophobic or nationalist or whatever. But the truth of the